started. All right, go ahead, Scott.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this all works. Got that one. Okay,
yep.
Everyone see that? Okay.
Looks good to me. Go ahead.
So I'm Scott. I'm going to present dispatching on my railroad. It's a small railroad. I'm only 13 by 14 foot.
Hey, Scott, you want to just let people know where you're from and just like a couple sentence introduction.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Scott Sabo, Edmonton, Alberta, up in Canada. One of my layouts is one of the layouts for Northern Rails. We do a operating weekend every 2 years. That's posted on the OPSIG website. I do N scale, and with COVID, I've got a lot of stuff done lately in the railroad, which is good. A lot of projects have been sitting on the shelf, got built, so that's great. So I'm going to talk about dispatching on my model railroad. It's Feather Mountain, and what I use is a manual block system, which is MBS, and I'm going to just quickly do my layout description, show you guys what it looks like. Quickly go through the prototype MBS and then the model version, because as always we tend to condense things to make things a little easier to use as we for model railroads rather than strictly prototype. So my railroad is basically a class 2, small branch line, let's say, based off Canadian national practices. I modeled 1977. There's a CN timetable, and I've developed my own timetable, as you'll see for reasons later on. The layout is basically, like I said, N scale. I'm in a 13 by 14 foot room, 100 feet of track, point to point, just 4 towns, 2 yards, and a 3-track staging, and I use Digitrax for my throttles. That's a picture of the room. It's basically the whole room's in one picture. So unlike a lot of people where they need several pictures, that's the whole thing right there. The door is to keep the cats out, so works quite well, unless I lock them in, then I'm in trouble. Okay, so the layout map looks like, so you see that okay? Got the map? Okay, so this is
we can see your map. Good,
so it's switching back and forth then, good. Okay, so I usually have 6 people in my room operating. 2 people lower down. That. So 2 people run the ground cache yard. I got 1 person up top in Colton, and then I got usually 3 people running the mainline trains. On the layout, green is mainline, pink is my sidings, and then black is yards and spurs. So for operating, like I said, 3 road engineers, 2 yard masters, a yard crew, and a dispatcher who's actually in a separate room. All trains are run as extras. I use manual block. And I also use JMRI Panel Pro for the dispatcher to keep track of the trains. Later on, at the end, I'll show you an example of how that all works. Got a telephone system for communications, run 6 to 1. I got a ABS, an absolute block signal system for train protection. And car forwarding, I use JMRI switch lists for the yards and manifest for the road crews. About 250 rail cars and 18 locomotives on the layout, and about 22 trains are run per session. So the prototype MBS, in Canada, they're very similar to your direct traffic control and track warrant. They're typically used on lower volume subdivisions, okay? During this, main lines are CTC, but the lower volume, they basically do, a lot of the train order ones have been converted over to manual block. And this happened between the 1970s and 80s. Mostly due to radio coverage. As radio coverage became better, they wanted to lessen the cost of operators, and they wanted to have the dispatcher talk directly to the train crews to give orders. CN and CP used MBS from the 70s to about 1990. At that time, the railroads were kind of left up to their own devices how to write the rules for MBS. Later on, Canadian Transportation got involved and made the Canadian Operating Rules, CROR, and they called it Occupancy Concurrent System, OCS, which is actually used today. So it's been used the last 30 years by CN and CP. In the mid-1980s, they've actually worked on a computer-aided MBS program where the dispatcher would actually enter stuff into a computer system. The computer would then set out the instructions that the operator or the dispatcher would then read out to the train crews, which avoided a lot of the problems they had, overlapping limits and all that kind of stuff. So the computer kept track of all that. So if you ever look this up in the UCOR, this is the 1962 version. In the UCOR, there's only 3 lines here that describe what a manual block rules are. Basically lifted up to the railroads to make up their own instructions. As the bottom says, section 323, special instructions is up to the railroad. So what I've got here, so this here is a timetable. I'm just going to quickly, I'm not going to do everything, but I'm just going to show you some highlights. This is a timetable from 1981, which would have been, at this time, this division was actually converted all over to MBS by this time. So this is a typical MBS timetable, how the train crews would see it. You can see there's basically southward and northward trains. Since all trains are run as extras, there's no schedules on here. This is just for the train crews to figure out the stations. You notice that in the timetable, there's the word MBS there written, showing the limits between what MBS is actually for, from what town to what town. And then when we go to the back of the system, back of the timetable, this is where your special instructions are for that division. And what happens now is section 2 is all the instructions CN would have for MBS. So this is what the train crews would have to go over. Now CP would have similar, but it would be slightly different. A couple things that are of note here is, let's scroll down. In yellow there, in MBS there is no superiority of trains. The clearance is the only authority of movement. So you have to have this authority to move, and everything is decided as extra or work extras. The other thing that MBS has had that I'm not sure if direct warrants and direct traffic control had, but MBS had bulletins, and these would be kind of standing orders for the division that would be printed off and given to the crews. A lot of common stuff in track, and I'll explain that a little bit later as well. The other thing, next page down. Right back there. So basically, a couple things here. Another thing about MBS, which kind of helps us out a bit as railroaders, is that this note right here is that with an MBS clearance, you don't need flag protection because your limits are your protection, and you're allowed only, there are cases where 2 trains can occupy limits, but your limits are basically your protection. So long as you stay inside the limits, you don't need flag protection as you go out. The other thing too is when a train is authorized to proceed, it only goes in one direction. And there's cases back where a train, if he's given a work clearance, he can work back and forth in between the limits. So that's for switching and doing all sorts of stuff like that. You can also set up track instructions for maintenance crews and all that kind of stuff. So again, maintenance crews can be given a track for protection and you can still work around it. Now, the big difference with MBS is that 2 trains can occupy the same limits, and there's a certain procedure that I'll explain to that as we go later on. So this is a typical MBS form filled out for CP Rail with a couple bulletins. All trains are written as extras. Box number 3 and box number 6 are probably the main 2 differences between Canadian MBSs and the track warrants and direct traffic control. Block 3 deals with bulletins. So these 2 yellows are actually bulletins, and a lot of the bulletins were issued for track conditions. Again, because of these secondary branches, that maintenance was deferred during these times, and so a lot of times they'll limit speed because of track conditions. So you see a lot of stuff like this. This is an example of Canadian National's block system. This is back, this form's from 1979. It's a little bit different. You can see there's no numbering on this. Some of the boxes are a little bit different. And again, here's another bulletin from CP or from CN Rail. So why did I choose MBS? A lot of people in my area, they want a throttle job. They want to have a throttle in their hands. Few wanted to be dispatchers, and even fewer still want to be an operator copying orders. This MBS actually works out pretty well because the dispatcher talks directly to the train crew. There's always a trade-off in how a prototype works and what's best in the model railroad, whether it's the size of layout, number of people, costs. I thought about going CTC one time, which I think all model railroaders need to do on their layouts because we run lots of trains. Sometimes the cost just isn't there. MBS is few forms, a communication system, and a computer. Also fun and not work. I want to make sure that something was relatively easy for people to pick up, because when we do Northern Rails, got a lot of new people coming here, and a lot of times the first hour, 45 minutes is like pandemonium because people are learning the system, learning the track, all that kind of stuff. I wanted something that's fairly simple and easy to pick up for people. So here's my model version of based on the CN. My two forms are actually printed or shown twice as big. I actually put two of these on a 8.5 by 11. Train crew on one side, and the dispatcher form on the other side, which is similar. When a lot of people dispatch with me, typically in the prototype, the dispatcher would write everything down into a book. And so I talked to the dispatchers, and they said they like the kind of the same form that they're talking about with the train crews. The only difference is that I've added an extra line there, second from the top, which is loads, empties, lengths, and weight. Those are given to the dispatcher. The only thing he's really interested in is length, because some of my trains are longer than some of the sidings. The loads, empties, weights, all that come off the JMRI manifest, so it's all easily given. The other thing I could do differently is if you look under proceed and work, typically they would write out the town names, all that kind of stuff. Since I've only got so many towns, I'm doing a circling thing. So it gets the guys going a little faster. Last thing I want to do is have guys fill 10 minutes worth of paperwork for maybe a 10-minute run or a 15-minute run. I like to get the guys going as soon as we can. And same with my work. I'll show you my work limits later on. So here's my timetable, kind of based on the one we saw earlier. Same idea, showing the trains and the footnotes and all that kind of stuff in the stations. I also give everybody a little schematic. So this is with the train crews. They'll have the timetable. They also have a small little schematic that shows them the length of sidings and the call letters at the bottom of the towns that match with the MBS form. Again, it's quite simple. You know, you're going from one town to another. The dispatcher, what I've got is he's in a separate room, and I've set up JMRI as a panel. And he's also got I'm doing everything by lineup. Everything goes through. We pick the next train down and just keep working. He'll have a lineup, so he has a rough idea what's coming next. The departure times are probably approximate, and it's give or take. Everything's run as an extra, so we can move things around. He can put trains through quicker or slower, whatever he likes to do. Screen, switch programs. So that's my JMRI panel. I've got two large big screens at home. And it's actually an active panel, and it's more or less like a glorified magnetic board with a few little enhancements I put in just to help the dispatcher. So what happens basically is the crew will call in. Once you get the paperwork and their JMRI switch lists and all that, and they got their instructions where they're going, crew will call in. They got a phone here. I developed the phone system's actually from Seth Newman. He had a dispatcher's article in 2012. So Seth's actually helped me out with some parts, so thanks for that. The crews fill in the forms based on what the dispatcher's talking about. And what I'm going to do is just quickly go through 4 of the basic types of clearances that happen. So the first one is a proceed. And everything in red is what will be filled out by the dispatcher and the crew. So this is order number 32. FM 121 is my way freight. He's basically going from Grand Cache to Smoky, and he's going to clear main track at Smoky. Now, what I'll do here, I'll show you what I do on JMRI. So FM 121 is down here in Grand Cache. Edit text. So the dispatch will change them because we use engine numbers here. He's there. So he's now giving them clearances. So what I've got here is I can go manually into JMRI. And now what I've done visually is I've shown that clearance I just gave him for the dispatcher. So now he knows, okay, that's the limits I've given that train. So the next one is sometimes you got to do meets and all that. Now they're very, very simple again. You've got a visual of what's going on. So order number 32 is the one we just gave on the left-hand side there, the extra 53 west. Extra 45 east is now, he actually got to go from Weldon down to Grand Cache. Now, what's happened now is that extra 53 West has actually got some of that track. So what we'll do here, we'll scroll over. So this guy here, oops, down to there. So he's going to be given this set for clearances. Now these aren't really these may look overlapping, but they're not, because one's taking the siding, one's taking the main track. So now the dispatcher has a visual. So eventually what's going to happen is extra 43 is going to be, extra 45 east is going to be here, and 55 west is here. Once they reach their cases, or if they do OS at certain stations, the dispatcher can actually roll this up behind them, clearing the tracks. So that's the situation we got there. So the next clearance is a work clearance. Okay, so like I said, extra 53 west was my way freight. He's got to do a bunch of switching at Smoky. We're going to assume that extra 43 is gone already. This time we're going to give him limits of where he can work between. I'm using mileposts here. One of the reasons I use mileposts and is because this is this quick little snapshot of Smoky. So this is all the area that he's going to be switching. The reason I used the milepost in red there is because I've got tunnels or view blocks, and I want to make sure that when they're working, they can see their train. Their train doesn't go around the corner, that everyone can see that, okay, I've got limits up to here. When the other trains come out of the tunnel, they can go up to those limits, which are marked on the layout. So they're physically actually marked with limits on the layout. And that way we don't got people making meets in tunnels where they can't see things. So the work clearance now looks a little bit different. So we're going to get 45 out of here. He's gone. And we're going to give extra 53 west a work block. So this is now, I've got these in red on the panel. I've got different work blocks already set up throughout the layout, because these are my standard switching areas. There's really nothing switching on the main. Everything's mostly off sidings. So now we've set him up with a work block. So he owns that main track. Now work blocks, again, MBS is only for main track. So he's got that all set up. Now, the next thing that's kind of handy from a dispatcher's point of view is the final set of proceeds is a proceed with restrictions now, okay? So what a proceed with restriction allows is any train that wants to go through a work block, he can do so with this manual block clearance. What they do is they put a restriction on for him to protect against extra 53 west between mileposts 13.8 and 10.1. So what that looks like is, I'll bring him down here. This is extra 5922 east. Oops, sorry about my typing. So what his clearance is going to look like is all the way down and his clearance goes right through the work block, and he's actually keeping the main. So his clearance goes through the work block. Now, when this extra gets here to the end of the work limits, he's got to contact X53 West to get clearance through there. It's up to these two trains now to work out how they're going to pass, okay? Extra 53 West does own it. The whole idea on the railroad is we're supposed to move trains as quickly as we can. It's up to Extra 53 West to make the main track clear or the siding, whatever works best, so that Extra 5932 can get through. If he doesn't, or if he holds things up, he has to deal with the dispatcher or the superintendent or the roadmaster, which is me. So the whole idea is let's just work all together, and these two guys just communicate in the train room because they're standing right next to each other. Now, the other thing we've got is MBS bulletins. I have a bunch of these already. They're like a catalog that I kind of pick and choose as we go. Some deal with track, some deal with cars, crossings. The last one in the 400 series deal with my signals. Not a lot of times, but sometimes I'll have a signal system go out that half hour before a session, and I'll throw one of these in there just to protect, just to make sure that they're knowing there's maintenance on there and all that kind of stuff. I haven't had to use these yet. Most of my dispatchers are busy enough doing what they're doing. If I see one of my dispatchers rail fanning in the train room, or if he's got his feet up on the desk, then I know to give him some bulletins to issue, and that'll keep him a little bit more busy. Pros of the system is that it's pretty simple for train crews. With JMRI Panel Pro, the dispatcher has a visual of what's going on in the layout with the limits. The computer does not need to be connected to the layout. Computer does not need to be connected to Digitrax or anything else. It can be standalone. Extra trains are run sequentially. So if things are running behind, it's not a big deal. I tried timetable one time, and unfortunately, a fellow had to wait because a superior train was delayed. And what was happening is he had to wait for about maybe 20 minutes or so. The dispatcher could have got through, but the dispatcher was busy doing other things. And on a small layout, things happen pretty quick. You don't have a lot of time to make things up as the session goes. Doing the communication between the train crews, the runs seem a little longer because you got a bit of paperwork to fill out and all that kind of stuff. And number 6 is really interesting because what I found is typically the yards are bottlenecks for the layouts, but by delaying my main lines a bit, and also I've got some yard saving techniques that the guys use, my yards can actually keep up with the mainline trains. And I found that was quite interesting because I'm sitting back kind of watching. Dispatcher writes between 45 and 55 clearances in 4 hours. That's like average. He'll be peaks and valleys, of course. Can be used with or without a ABS signal system. A lot of these were actually used in dark territory on a lot of these smaller branch lines. The cons is pretty much era specific. So we're talking 62 to 1990. OCS, which is similar, is after that. You'll need some kind of communication system, the layout. Computer is required. It is less challenging than timetable and train order because the crews are basically not having to figure out what, if they're going to make it to the next town or look at a timetable. They got their instructions in front of them and everything's ready to go. So that's basically the end of it. I have my own timetable. Like I said before, we host Northern Rails, and if anybody wants to dispatch, on one of these Northern Rail sessions, I will give them a commemorative timetable to honor them for actually volunteering to the dispatch, and also they'll get the name in the timetable for next time. So hopefully over the years, my list of dispatches will increase. So yeah, I think that's about it. How do I do for time?
Oh, you're doing just fine.
Was that
yeah, we got. Sorry, I can't speak today. Got a few questions for you. How long do your operating sessions run?
Roughly about 4 hours. I've had some run longer because when things, I think we did 5 hours one time at Northern Rails, and that was just because things just took longer and the guys wanted to keep running trains. So we said, okay, let's just keep running trains.
Yep. Let's see. Do the Canadian roads use OCS in the States as well?
They do. The funny thing is I've got some things from 2013. They call it track warrant, but if you look at the form, it's very much the same as an OCS form.
Okay. Is your JMRI, was that the layout editor that you were playing with there?
Yes. Yeah, layout.
Okay.
Editor.
All right. Do you use a separate screen for yard and crew?
In what regards?
Well,
is that for the JMR switch list and manifest?
Yeah. Hold on a second. Your switches are not dispatcher controlled. Burr is asking.
Right. No, they're not. Usually,
Okay.
a lot of the smaller ones, smaller subdivisions, they weren't controlled by the dispatcher.
Okay. Let me find Brad here and let him ask his question. Hey, Brad, can you ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, you've got 2 screens there for your dispatcher. Do you have a separate screen where you keep track of your trains and so forth, print up your paperwork and?
Yeah. So what I do is, this is purely like I said, a glorified magnet board. It's all manual. I don't have train detection coming back to the computer. For my ABS system, I built it 25 years ago. It's got its own detection system. with its own logic and its own circuit boards and all that. I thought about trying to implement that into JMRI, but the costs and all the hassle was just too much. I then discovered this system, which I think works pretty good for what I want it to do. As far as JMRI is concerned, everybody works off paper switch lists. I'll print them out before the session starts, everything.
Okay, well, that's what I'm doing exactly the same thing you are, except I've got a magnet board. I use JMRI switch lists, and but during the session, we tend to have to print up additional paperwork. And that was my question, whether you needed an additional screen to access your paperwork and not screw up the dispatcher screens.
Right. Yeah, I know. So there's been a big debate on, well, not a debate, but a difference of opinion. I print off all my forms before the session starts. So all my paperwork's done, and I also, like, I can talk about this for hours, but I print off everything. So everything is printed off. Sometimes cars get lost because they're not where they're supposed to be because of, let's say, human error or something. And this is something I live with. I've got workarounds for that. But so I don't use the computer for JMRI during the session, only before and then afterwards.
Okay, so if I wanted to use, basically we're talking about 3 screens here because my railroad's probably a little bit bigger than this and would take at least 2 screens.
Yeah, I've seen people also stack their layout. Like,
right.
They'll have, one line on top, one line on the bottom. That would work too.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Eric.
Another question, Scott. How do you qualify a visiting engineer to decide if they can try a light train versus going out with a 2-man crew?
Well, that's, yeah, good question. So my layout room is small. I can't really afford the extra bodies in there for a 2-man crew. When we host a session, there's myself and my friend Dennis Miller. We're the 2 people, the support people that are supporting everybody. So it's very tough to put 2 people on a train to tell them exactly what to do. Once the guys figure out, get 1 train around the layout or 2 trains around the layout, it actually becomes second nature to them. It's just getting that first train around and getting used to the system.
Yep.
And that's the thing you usually fall behind.
There's a question, so you already answered that. When trains work spurs, the length and weight of the train may change. How does the dispatcher take this into consideration when the train continues moving on its route?
Okay, so with JMRI, what will happen is when the train starts off, you'll get loads, empties, and lengths and weight. When you go to the next town and do a bunch of switching, JMRI at the bottom of the manifest, or at the next section of the manifest, will give you the new weights and loaded cars and lengths and all that. So as the train goes from town to town, that length will change, and it's all written on the JMRI forms.
Okay. Does the ABS signal system cover the same track as the MBS?
Yes, it does. It's interesting, in one of the timetables that I found is that ABS is only for train protection, not authority. So it's very clearly stated in those special instructions I've shown you. So basically, if you got a green light, but your MBS does not show you going into that next section, you still cannot go in there. So it's the MBS that rules the authority.
Got it. Okay. I think that's the end of the question. So Scott, thanks so much for presenting. Would you be willing to share your presentation so I can put it up on the OPSIG site?
Sure, I'll send it to you later on today.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks, guys.
All right, we're going to move on to Dana Driskel, who I just unmuted. Hopefully it will take care of that.
Hello. All right, great. Well, first of all, I was impressed by what Scott had to say. And it's nice to see a fellow small gauger, small scale, and also a relatively small room. I think I actually outdo you, Scott, in terms of a small room, but we'll see. This is going to be a little bit of a story of the history of a railroad in addition to the layout. So first and foremost, I live in Goleta, California, which is a few miles west of Santa Barbara, out on the California coast. And yet I didn't choose to do really a California railroad. I chose to do something in Nevada. So if you look over my shoulder, the Salt Lake route is where I want to go with this. Now I'm going to have to share screen here at this point. And bring up the optimized and the share screen. Okay. Let's see now here. Next in the slideshow and up and running. Does everybody see this? LA&SL Third Sub?
Yeah, that video quality looks really bad right now.
The video quality does?
Yeah, I mean, it's all what I'm seeing on my screen, and if other people see it as well, please type it in the chat. Right now, everything looks very pixelated.
Okay, that will be a problem. I optimized for video. Should I go back and unplug that?
Okay, it's starting to
PowerPoint.
it's starting to clear up.
Well, if it's a problem for you, it's probably a problem for others. So why don't I go back and get rid of the optimizing?
Yeah,
Optimizing might be something they do for video.
Yeah, that's what I was saying is if you want to do that Vimeo thing, we'll walk through that when you're ready to share, but otherwise don't do the optimize.
Okay, so I'll come into here, I'll get rid of the optimized and that, and I will come back up to here. See if we got any.
Yeah,
any better?
that's much better. Sorry, I should have been clear. When you get to the point where you want to do the Vimeo, that's when you want to click that optimize, not right now. Right now it looks great.
Live and learn, live and learn. Thanks, I appreciate that. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is get us up to there. Okay, LA&SL Third Sub. And I already explained briefly who I am, other than the fact that I also do a certain amount of due diligence at Gary Siegel's L&N Railroad in Montecito, California, where I am banished to the mole, where I serve the trains and push trains out at everybody, which is a lot of fun. I have to be somewhat of a masochist to be a mole, but I'm somewhat of a masochist because I'm doing N-scale steam. With that being said, the Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad Company, also known as the Salt Lake Route. San Pedro, Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad was the original name for this until 1915, when San Pedro was sucked up by Los Angeles, became part of the city, and they dropped it to Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad. Now, this is, I'll get into it in a moment, a portion of the Union Pacific, but they actually used the Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad Company name all the way until 1988. But I'm doing 1920, so that's almost irrelevant. However, if you wanted to check it for history, and you looked at the Union Pacific's, their description of what it is, they would call it today the Union Pacific's Northern Regions Rocky Mountain Service Unit Southwestern Arm. And for those who are into geography, you'll be surprised to know that the Union Pacific considers Yermo, California to be part of the Rocky Mountains. So this is what it looked like in 1920. And this map, as it was handcrafted by somebody way back in the day, indicates that the red line there runs from down in the southwestern corner, San Pedro, California, all the way up to Salt Lake. And you can see all the connecting routes. The teal colored aquamarine one there is UP, but the rest of them are also servers. And so it gives me plenty to work from as I route cars to get them on and off the railroad. I chose 1920 because it's the year before the Union Pacific completely absorbed the Los Angeles and Salt Lake. Originally, it was cobbled together by two brothers, William Andrews Clark, who was a copper baron, had made enough money and wanted to make more, and he had decided to create a railroad out of a variety of small railroads in the Los Angeles area. He had a younger brother, Ross, and I'll mention him in a moment, but for right now, recognize that by 1920, they are on timetable 59 at the end of the year. Now, I said this was 50% Union Pacific and 50% Clark interests, and that's because E.H. Harriman had decided that this was a good railroad to get involved with because UP needed an entry into Los Angeles to compete with the Santa Fe, already there, and the Southern Pacific, most definitely already there. So they bought in with the Clarks and they took a 50-50 position on the railroad. And by 1920, everything's amiable, but we're up to a 59th timetable. Now, earlier in that year, they started this year. Another reason why I like 1920 is it started as USRA Railroad. Then in March, it became timetable number 57, followed by timetable 58, and finally I closed with 59. This is what it would look like in my portion of the railroad, which is in Nevada. That's third subdivision. There were 5 basic subdivisions and a lot of other little branches and such, and I'll get into those as well. But you'll see that as they did it in those days, you end up with a lot of passenger traffic. And so I have 3 legitimate trains going east, 3 going west, and of course that doesn't count sections or anything that might run as an extra. Those are listed trains, and you can also see there's 2 listed freights. So that gives me plenty to do, or for my operators to do. This is what Las Vegas looked like about that time. Some people will think possibly that Las Vegas is created by gangsters, and perhaps it was, but these were a different form of gangsters. The Ross brothers had come in here and set up a town effectively because it's equidistant, roughly equidistant between Salt Lake and Los Angeles. And Las Vegas, the springs, there was water. So they established this town, literally established it, set out the grid. It even became, one time it was Lincoln County and it got changed to Clark County, Nevada, and guess who the Clarks were. So anyway, this is what Vegas looks like, and I don't have to model it. This is the other end of the subdivision. This is Caliente, Nevada, and this indicates that this was also something that was photographed before 1920, 22, 23, when the Union Pacific completely owned the railroad, and they ended up putting in mission revival style depot instead of this old wood framed one. So anyway, those are the 2 ends, but they're both too complicated to model for someone of my limited abilities. So instead, I do Moapa, Nevada. And you're looking at it pretty much what it looked like and how many things were going on in Moapa in 1920. And it's out in the middle of nowhere, but it's an interesting point of departure to another branch. Now, the goal was to originally make Moapa quite a railroad town and a big town in the deserts of Nevada. That never really came to be. All of those plots and building spaces are still pretty much an opportunity for those of you who want to move to, as you can see down to the bottom, Clark County, Nevada. This is what it would look like. I shot this back in the late 90s, and I'm standing on the foundation of the depot. There is no depot at Moapa. In fact, there's not that palm tree, and if Bruce Morton's on the call, he'll testify that the palm tree no longer exists. It was either burned down or for one reason or another, not even the palm tree is there. But the palm tree was built for the railroad when they were making this a landscaped space. And the buildings pretty much have fallen down as well. But the Union Pacific does roll by every day. This is what Moapa looks like in terms of blueprinting. And one thing about watching out when you check blueprints is sometimes the blueprints won't include everything. For instance, this indicates this is a branch shooting off from the main line going down to the bottom of the page, but it's actually a Y. And I knew it was a Y because it is a Y to this day, but I wasn't sure when it was established until I looked at other materials and realized, and you can see it over on the right-hand side, there was a Y way back in the 1910s. And there's also this wonderful one here that indicates that the PFE did have a siding there, a dedicated siding, so they could ice up various reefer cars that were rolling away, coming from Los Angeles and heading east. I'm a big fan of whys. I like whys because they create a certain amount of confusion for operators, and you know, everybody says have fun. Oh, I think people can have fun and also be frustrated and confused at the same time. So I chose to work on this particular part of the railroad because it has a branch called the St. Thomas branch. And at one end, there's a Y at St. Thomas, and at the other end, there's a Y at Moapa. And that's really the primary focus of my little N-scale railroad. Now, as far as that goes, looking back at this again at what a timetable looked like, employee's timetable, you can see Las Vegas at the top, and looking down about midway, you see Moapa. You do not see St. Thomas because the branch has its own designation. But when I simplified my timetable to use on the layout, I made it so that I dropped the St. Thomas branch down there at the bottom just to make it easier for people to be able to find things that were going on. Now, I do replicate the passenger trains that go east and west and roll by Moapa, and the freight trains, and I actually added one. I decided that the PFE probably did roll a dedicated fruit train by virtually every day. And since the St. Thomas branch was very prolific in fruits and vegetables, it's highly likely that they would have had to stop there almost every day to pick up carloads. So I extend a little bit of the storyline there to say, yes, we run enough fruit and vegetables off the branch that it's almost inevitable we must have a train to carry them. I use a very simplified TT&TO on the railroad. There's an example on the left of how beautifully they could be crafted back in the day. And I made a simpler one just using Microsoft Word, which allows me to tell the operators where to go. Also use your car cards, the conventional old car cards, four-sided and such. And this is an example of one of the stations along the branch. It says St. Thomas subdivision. This was lifted directly from an ETT. And it does show that there was a first-class train that ran in both directions each day that came up the branch from St. Thomas to Moapa and then returned in the evening. And let's see, what else do I have here? Yes, okay. We use 4 people in the railroad. It's a very small room. It's 14 feet long by 9.5 across. In other words, it's half a garage. And Bruce Morden, who might well be on the call, he's a regular on this railroad, and he will testify that he is under the cruel boot heel of our general manager, Jackie Lope. And if we get lucky, I'll be able to share the screen and show you a little QuickTime here that I put together. And Eric, I guess that means I'm going to go back and change to share screen so I have the optimized for video. If anyone's interested, this is also on Vimeo, what I'm going to show you, a little 8-minute clip. And so you could pick it up, and if you have any hitchiness or stalling on this, I don't think you'll have any problems if you go directly to the Vimeo site. So perhaps Eric can put that up on the chat. Okay, and I'm done with PowerPoint. And I need to stop the share and then start the share. And this time I'm going to optimize. Tips for everybody else who's going to have to do this in the future. Share. And next thing up will be to show you a movie. All right. So, can you hear me?
Yep, can you hear just fine.
Okay, great. So, any questions? Because I have run out of things to say and show.
Yeah, there's a few questions here. Let me scroll back. Where's the pianist located? Let's see. And this is a DC control layout, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Somebody says, love the motor car. What can you describe what you built? I mean, I'm assuming it's scratch built.
It's a scratch built. I guess it's about that long. I've been a fan of the McKeen motor cars for a long time. Hang on a moment. Also like to operate in larger scales. So this is a McKeen that I did in 1/32 scale. So the difference between a 1/32 scale McKeen and a 1/60th is significant. But anyway, yeah, the McKeen motor car and the McKeen Motor Company.
Hey, Dana, just for clarification, there was actually a model company called McKeen Models. So you're talking, this was the original manufacturer, was also known as McKeen, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
A derivative to an extent of the Union Pacific. They had that area locked up. And what it meant was that they had a gasoline or diesel powered machine, and they ran all over the West. They originally were designed with the idea that they'd run in cities, but electrification of cities made them sort of an odd duck. But they did end up running in Omaha and the Midwest, even into the 1940s. I found demonstrations of them. There's a couple that are still prototypes that still exist, but they're relatively strange and curious car, but I just love them.
Yep. Let's see. How many, where'd the question go? Chuck's asking, didn't early McKeen cars run on distillate?
They did. Okay. They did, but they cobbled it. The first ones actually, I think the very first one used a marine diesel engine, but they tried different engines. And the only existing one that I know that's operational is up in Carson City, Nevada. And it runs they had to come up with something that was OSHA approved, et cetera. And I think they're using something out of a Caterpillar tractor.
Yep, Rich Gosselin, that is a jackalope on the wall there. He's talking about the horned rabbit. I'm like, that's a jackalope, as far as I'm aware. Yep. Let's see. Just going back through, how many people operate during a session?
Where I'm sitting right now is where the Moapa Yard master would be, and he'd actually have his back turned to you working here. A second person would be down in the foreground here, who would be working on the branch, which is down in front. And a third person would be our operator who's bringing trains along the main line. And the main line runs from the west through to Moapa, through to the east, and returns and disappears. That's how I can get it to the second level up there. It goes outside, and you saw in the video that there's a helix outside on the other side of the wall. So my job as the fourth person is to be outdoors, outside the wall, and I'm serving trains from, if they're coming from the west, they're coming from Las Vegas. If they're coming from the east, they're coming from Caliente. But they breeze through Moapa, do their work, head on, and eventually come back and make their way on and off the railroad.
Got it. Gordon Bliss is asking, Dana, I also run some steam and N scale. Do you do anything special in keeping your fleet running well?
Cheat as much as possible. For instance, the Los Angeles Limited that I used in there, it's a adequately running Pacific, but because, and this is what I love about doing diesel level or diesel era
end scale is you've always got a bumper car to help the other one. You can't do that in steam very well. So my baggage car on that one is also disguised, and it has a motor in it as well. So it's like a lash up of two different locomotives pushing it. Surprisingly enough, the little switcher engines are okay. And I do try to keep the tracks as clean as one can in the garage. But usually we can get away with that.
Okay. With the DC, does the dispatcher send power to blocks according to the timetable, or do the operators using toggles along the route?
There's a switch plate over there, and actually the third member, this job here as the yard master is a job and a half. The one who's operating the branch is only going to be running the McKeen up and down and also receiving the turn and various things that come down. So that's pretty busy too. The third person is effectively the dispatcher. They control the blocks. There are only 5 blocks for the main, and they have control of it. The only one who would interfere with that, and they're operating the trains back and forth, would be the Moapa Yard master, who could potentially find a way of requesting the main. But most of the time, I use the logic that comes in here. It's still mainline, and they better be prepared for any mainline trains. They're all listed. I use a clock, and we work in evenings usually when we run. That's about a 2.5-hour session, and a little portal time, maybe 3.5 hours after dinner. We'll get together and run. But it's I guess it's about a 4 to 1 clock would be a guess.
Okay. And we'll make this the last, looks like this is the last question. How wide is the upper deck? So right behind you where that freight train's sitting.
Right there. If I can do the scale on this, you can see it's
So,
hardly anything. It's only about
4 or 5 inches, maybe.
That'd be a good guesstimate.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
And it was added in a little bit later on. At first, I had it worked out that it would return outside. But when I realized that I could do a double deck for Las Vegas and Caliente, that gave me the impetus to bring the second one around. Plus, it gave me a climbing helper district.
Got it. Okay. And somebody else admired that it's a 6-point jackalope, and the fact that 8-point alpha males are rarely seen by the public. So that's quite the one you've got there. But
that's right.
Anyway,
backyard.
All right. Well, if you can, if you don't mind sharing your presentation, I'll put it up on the website along with a link to the Vimeo, which did stream just fine through the.
Oh.
As long as you do the exactly what you did, you optimized it when you're sending the video, and it worked great. So, Dana, thanks so much for sharing. Everybody seems to have enjoyed it. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording.